The Cadaver Synod, when the Vatican put a corpse on trial. In the winter of 897 A.D., the most powerful ecclesiastical court in the Christian world convened in the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome. Cardinals, bishops, and clergy gathered in their finest vestments. A defendant sat in a chair before them, dressed in papal robes, awaiting judgment. There was only one problem. The defendant had been dead for 9 months. This was the Cadaver Synod, Latin name Synodus Horrenda, the horrible synod, perhaps the most macabre legal proceeding in history. Pope Stephen VI had ordered the exhumation of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, whose decomposing corpse was then propped up in the papal throne, dressed in full pontifical vestments, and subjected to a formal trial. A deacon stood behind the rotting body, speaking for the deceased pope who could no longer speak for himself. What followed was a spectacle so grotesque, so unprecedented, that it would shake the foundations of the Catholic Church and trigger a cascade of violence, revenge, and counter-revenge that lasted for years. The Cadaver Synod stands as a testament to the depths of political depravity that even the holiest institutions can sink to when power, ambition, and hatred collide. The man they hated, even in death, to understand why Pope Stephen VI would do something so seemingly insane, we need to understand Formosus, the man, the pope, and the political player whose actions in life created enemies who wouldn't rest even after his death. Formosus was born around 816 A.D. into the Roman aristocracy. His name, ironically, means handsome in Latin. He rose through the ecclesiastical ranks with impressive speed, becoming Cardinal Bishop of Porto in 864. His intellect and diplomatic skills made him valuable to the papacy, and he was sent on important missions to Bulgaria and France. But Formosus was also ambitious, dangerously so for the political landscape of 9th century Rome. The papacy wasn't just a religious office, it was a temporal power caught in the endless struggle between rival noble families, competing kings, and the remnants of the Carolingian Empire. Every appointment, every alliance, every decision carried political weight that could make or break dynasties. In 872, Formosus was accused of conspiring to become pope and of aspiring to the Bulgarian bishopric. He was excommunicated and forced to flee Rome, though he was eventually rehabilitated and his titles restored. He had made powerful enemies. The Spoleto family, one of Rome's most influential dynasties, particularly despised him. When Formosus finally did become pope in 891, at the age of 75, he inherited a church in chaos. Rome was essentially controlled by competing noble families who used the papacy as a political tool. The position of pope had become so dangerous that 5 different men had held the office in the 6 years before Formosus's election. Violence, intrigue, and sudden death were the norm, the fatal alliance. Pope Formosus made a decision that would seal his posthumous fate. He needed military protection against the Spoleto family, who had essentially turned Rome into their personal fiefdom. So he invited Arnulf of Carinthia, the king of East Francia, to invade Italy and be crowned Holy Roman Emperor. This was a direct betrayal of the Spoleto family's interests. They had supported a different candidate for emperor, their own Guy III of Spoleto, whom a previous pope had already crowned. By inviting Arnulf to Rome, Formosus was essentially asking a foreign power to destroy the very families who controlled the city. Arnulf came. In 896, he marched into Rome with an army, and Formosus crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. The Spoleto family was temporarily neutralized, but Arnulf soon fell ill and had to return to Germany, leaving Formosus without his military protector. Just months later, in April 896, Pope Formosus died. The circumstances of his death aren't entirely clear. He was in his 80s, so natural causes are likely. But in the vicious political climate of Rome, some historians suspect poison. Either way, his death came at exactly the wrong time for his legacy. The Spoleto family saw their opportunity for revenge. The Puppet Pope. After Formosus died, there was a brief interregnum. Pope Boniface VI held the office for just 15 days before dying himself under mysterious circumstances. Then came Pope Stephen VI. Stephen was almost certainly a puppet of the Spoleto family. Some sources suggest he was the son of a priest named John, though others claim he was related to the Spoleto nobility directly. What's clear is that he owed his papacy to the same families Formosus had betrayed. The Spoletos didn't just want to undo Formosus's political decisions, they wanted to destroy his legacy entirely. And they found a willing instrument in Stephen VI, who either shared their hatred of his predecessor or was too weak to resist their demands. In January 897, just 9 months after Formosus had been buried in St. Peter's Basilica, Stephen VI gave an order that shocked even the violence-hardened population of Rome. Dig him up. The trial of the century. The scene in the Basilica of St. John Lateran must have been surreal beyond imagination. The corpse of Formosus, in an advanced state of decomposition, was dressed in the full papal vestments he had worn in life. The body was propped up, or possibly tied, to a throne. A teenage deacon was positioned behind the corpse, forced to speak on behalf of the dead pope. Pope Stephen VI acted as prosecutor. The charges were multiple: that Formosus had obtained the papacy by perjury, that he had violated canon law by switching from one bishopric to another, from Porto to Rome, and that as a layman who had been previously stripped of holy orders, he had no right to become pope at all. The trial was, of course, a farce. The outcome was predetermined. The deacon speaking for Formosus had no real defense to offer. How could he? The entire proceeding was designed not to establish truth, but to publicly humiliate a dead man and legally invalidate everything he had done as pope. Contemporary accounts describe the trial as grotesque theater. Some sources claim that the corpse's mouth fell open during the proceedings, creating the horrifying impression that it was trying to speak. The smell must have been overwhelming. Cardinals and bishops sat through this nightmare either too terrified to object or complicit in the revenge plot. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty on all counts. The punishment, the sentence handed down against Formosus's corpse, was comprehensive and vindictive. First, all of his acts as pope were declared null and void. Every priest he had ordained, every bishop he had consecrated, every decree he had issued, all were invalidated with a single judgment. Then came the physical punishments. The papal vestments were stripped from the corpse. The 3 fingers of the right hand that Formosus had used to give blessings were hacked off with a sword. The mutilated body was then dragged through the streets of Rome by a mob, subjected to further indignities. Finally, the corpse was thrown into the Tiber River. This last act was particularly significant. In Christian belief, proper burial was essential for resurrection and salvation. By denying Formosus a grave, Stephen VI was attempting to damn his predecessor's soul for eternity. It was spiritual murder added to the physical desecration. The river gives him back. But the story doesn't end there. According to multiple contemporary sources, something happened that the Romans interpreted as divine intervention. A monk or hermit living along the Tiber, accounts vary on his exact identity, discovered the corpse of Formosus washed up on the riverbank. He recognized the papal vestments, or perhaps was told in a vision who this was. The monk retrieved the body and gave it a secret burial. Word spread through Rome. People began reporting miracles at the site where Formosus was buried. The mutilated corpse, they said, was performing healings and other wonders. Public opinion, which had been silent during the trial out of fear, began to turn against Stephen VI. The political situation in Rome was also shifting. The Spoleto family's grip on power was weakening. Other noble factions sensed vulnerability, and the horror of what had been done in the Lateran Basilica was too much even for a population accustomed to violence and intrigue. Divine retribution or political revenge. In the summer of 897, just months after the Cadaver Synod, an earthquake struck Rome. Buildings collapsed. People died. And in the superstitious mindset of medieval Europe, natural disasters were never just natural. They were signs of God's displeasure. The population blamed Stephen VI. They blamed him for desecrating a pope's body, for turning the church into a theater of horror, for bringing divine wrath down upon the city. Riots erupted. A mob stormed the Lateran palace. Pope Stephen VI was seized, stripped of his vestments, and thrown into prison. There, in a dark cell, he was either strangled or left to starve to death. Sources disagree on the exact method of execution. He had been pope for just over a year. His successor, Pope Theodore II, immediately convened a synod that reversed the Cadaver Synod's decisions. Formosus was declared to have been a legitimate pope. His body was retrieved from its secret grave, dressed once again in papal robes, and reburied in St. Peter's Basilica with full honors. But the violence didn't stop there. The next pope, after Theodore, John IX, was also sympathetic to Formosus's memory. He held yet another synod that formally condemned the Cadaver Synod and banned all future trials of dead people. The bishops who had participated in the trial of Formosus's corpse were punished. Some deposed, others excommunicated. The pornocracy and its aftermath, the Cadaver Synod, occurred during what historians call the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age, or sometimes the pornocracy, a period from roughly 904 to 909-964 A.D., when the papacy was controlled by corrupt Roman noble families who treated it as a political prize rather than a spiritual office. During this era, popes were murdered, deposed, and replaced with alarming frequency. The office that claimed to be the earthly representative of Christ had become a commodity bought, sold, and fought over by aristocrats who cared more about power than piety. The Cadaver Synod was perhaps the nadir of this period, the single most degrading moment in papal history. It demonstrated just how far the institution had fallen from its spiritual mission. A corpse on trial wasn't just macabre theater. It was a symbol of everything wrong with the church that had lost its way. But the backlash against Stephen VI and the rehabilitation of Formosus also showed that there were limits to what even a degraded church would tolerate. Some violations were so profound, so offensive to basic human decency and religious principle, that they provoked reform movements. Historical echoes. The Cadaver Synod wasn't entirely without precedent. The practice of posthumous trials, while rare, existed in various legal traditions. The Roman Empire occasionally prosecuted the estates of deceased criminals. Medieval European courts sometimes tried corpses or even animals. In 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake for heresy. 25 years later, the Church held a retrial and declared her innocent, though by then she was long dead. Her posthumous exoneration didn't bring her back to life, but it did restore her honor and pave the way for her eventual canonization as a saint. More recently, in the Soviet show trials of the 1930s, defendants were often forced to confess to crimes they hadn't committed, their trials predetermined by political necessity rather than truth. The corpse of Pope Formosus, sitting in judgment, is not so different from the living political prisoners forced to denounce themselves before execution. The Cadaver Synod reminds us that institutions, even religious ones that claim divine authority, are ultimately run by humans with all their capacity for pettiness, cruelty, and political calculation. What the Vatican doesn't talk about, modern Catholic historians approach the Cadaver Synod with a mix of embarrassment and fascination. It's not a story the Vatican highlights in its official histories. The Church prefers to focus on its saints and theological achievements, rather than the period when popes regularly murdered each other and put corpses on trial. But the Cadaver Synod is part of the historical record, documented in multiple contemporary sources, including the writings of Liutprand of Cremona and the Annals of Fulda. The Catholic Church acknowledges that it happened, even as it emphasizes how such behavior was condemned by subsequent popes, and represents a departure from church teaching rather than an expression of it. In some ways, the Church's honest confrontation with this dark chapter is admirable. Many institutions try to hide their shameful pasts. The Catholic Church, to its credit, maintains records of even its most embarrassing moments, allowing historians to study and learn from them. Lessons from a corpse. What does the Cadaver Synod teach us? Perhaps that power without accountability becomes monstrous, that institutions can be corrupted when they serve political masters rather than their founding principles, that revenge, even when cloaked in legal proceedings, remains revenge. It also teaches us about the importance of dignity, even for the dead. The outrage that Romans felt at seeing Formosus's corpse mutilated and desecrated shows that even in a brutal age, there were lines that shouldn't be crossed. The dead cannot defend themselves, which makes crimes against them particularly cowardly. The Cadaver Synod is a reminder that history is stranger and darker than we often imagine. We like to think of institutions like the papacy as eternal, unchanging, guided by divine providence. But the historical reality is far messier. Popes were human. They made mistakes, committed crimes, and sometimes descended into madness. The final irony. Here's the ultimate irony of the Cadaver Synod. By trying to erase Formosus from history, Stephen VI ensured that he would never be forgotten. If Stephen had simply let Formosus rest in his grave, the old pope would likely be a footnote, one of many barely remembered medieval pontiffs. Instead, by putting a corpse on trial, Stephen created one of the most memorable stories in church history. Formosus became famous, not for his political maneuvering or his theological contributions, but for being the pope who was judged after death. And Stephen VI? He's remembered too, but only as the madman who presided over the Cadaver Synod, whose hatred was so consuming that not even death could satisfy it. Conclusion: the Pope who wouldn't stay buried today, if you visit St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, you won't find Formosus's tomb easily marked or celebrated. He rests somewhere in the vast necropolis beneath the church, alongside dozens of other popes whose names are largely forgotten. But his story lives on, not in marble monuments or golden inscriptions, but in the historical record of human folly and institutional corruption. The Cadaver Synod stands as a warning across the centuries that the thirst for power and revenge can drive even the most sacred institutions to commit acts of profound moral degradation. Pope Formosus was put on trial 9 months after his death. He was found guilty, mutilated, and thrown into a river. But history has rendered a different verdict. In the court of human memory, it's not Formosus who stands condemned, but those who couldn't let him rest in peace. The corpse they dragged through the streets of Rome has long since turned to dust. But the story of what was done to him endures, a bizarre, horrifying, and utterly human tale from the depths of the Dark Ages, when even death wasn't enough to escape the political vendettas of medieval Rome.